Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at the music industry.
Ooh, exciting.
And here's the catch, not the side you see on MTV or, splashed all over social media. We're going deep on the often hidden financial struggles that musicians face today.
Yeah, a lot of people think it's all glamour,
Right.
but the reality is often very different.
Exactly. And to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be using Kate Nash and her recent, well, let's just call it a punk rock approach to her career as a guide.
I love that punk rock approach.
Yeah.
She's really not afraid to challenge the status quo.
Exactly. She's really pushing boundaries and forcing us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the music industry.
It's so refreshing to see someone willing to speak out like that.
Right? And what's really got people talking is her statement that she might make more money from her OnlyFans account than she did from her entire recent tour.
Yeah, that definitely raised some eyebrows.
To say the least. But it also got me thinking, how is that even possible? You'd think that with packed venues and expensive tickets, touring would be a surefire way for musicians to rake it in.
You would think so, wouldn't you? But it turns out that touring can actually be a huge financial drain for a lot of musicians.
Wait, really? Why is that? I mean, I know it's expensive to put on a show, but you'd think that ticket sales would cover it.
Well, the problem is that the costs of touring have gone up dramatically in recent years, while musician fees have largely remained stagnant.
So it's like everything else, the cost of living is going up, but the paychecks aren't keeping pace.
Exactly. We're talking about things like venue fees, travel expenses for the band and crew, equipment rentals. It all adds up.
Wow, I never really considered all of those expenses before. It's like a whole hidden world behind the scenes of a concert.
It is. And to make matters worse, musicians often don't have much negotiating power when it comes to things like venue fees.
So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, pretty much. Nash actually gave this great example. She's playing the same venue now as she did 10 years ago, but for the same fee.
Really? But think about how much more expensive everything is now compared to then.
Exactly. It's a perfect illustration of how the economics of touring are working against musicians.
So it's like running on a treadmill. You're working harder and harder, but you're not actually getting ahead.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, have you noticed how much more expensive concert tickets have become?
Oh, absolutely. It feels like every time I buy a ticket, I'm paying more and more.
Right. And so where do you think that extra money is going?
I mean, you'd assume it's going to the artists, right?
You'd hope so, but that's often not the case. A lot of that extra money ends up going to venues, promoters, and ticketing companies.
Wow, that's really eye-opening. I think a lot of us, myself included, have this assumption that the artists are the ones raking it in, but that's not always the reality.
Not at all. And this is where Nash's story gets even more interesting.
Yeah, because she's turned to a pretty unconventional way to fund her tours.
Right. We're talking about OnlyFans.
Yep, OnlyFans. Her slogan is bottoms for tour buses, which is certainly, let's say, memorable.
It definitely gets your attention.
It does. But it's important to note that she's made it very clear that this isn't just about the money.
It's about so much more than that.
It's a statement. It's about taking control of her career and her finances and challenging the way artists are often undervalued.
Exactly. She's reclaiming her agency and her power.
And sparking a really important conversation about how we value art and artists in our society.
Which is something we desperately need to be talking about.
Couldn't agree more. And it's not just her. Lily Allen actually shared that she made more money selling pictures of her feet on OnlyFans than she did from Spotify streams.
Yeah, I heard about that. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really puts things into perspective, right? It makes you realize that the traditional ways of making money in the music industry just aren't working for a lot of artists anymore.
It's a broken system.
And that's why it's so important to have these conversations and to explore alternative models.
Exactly. We need to find ways to support artists that are sustainable and equitable.
And maybe learn a thing or two from those who have been operating outside of the traditional systems for a while now.
Like sex workers, as Nash suggests.
Now that's a conversation for another time.
Definitely. But it's a fascinating one to think about. It challenges us to question our assumptions and consider new possibilities.
And that's what this deep dive is all about. So, to sum up, touring isn't the cash cow it used to be, if it ever was. In fact, for many artists, it's a financial burden, even if they manage to sell out venues.
Right, and that's due to a whole bunch of factors: rising costs, stagnant fees, a system that often prioritizes profits over artists.
And that leads us to ask the question, how can we ensure artists are paid fairly for their work?
And what role do we, as fans, play in creating a more sustainable and equitable music industry?
Big questions. And we're going to tackle those head on in the rest of this deep dive. But for now, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve even deeper into the specific challenges musicians are facing when it comes to touring in today's music landscape.
Sounds good. I'm ready to keep digging.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dig even deeper into the not-so-glamorous side of the music industry.
Yeah, let's get down to brass tacks.
So before the break, we were talking about how the cost of touring has skyrocketed, but musician fees haven't really kept up.
Right, it's a real problem.
I'm curious, what are some of the biggest expenses that musicians face when they hit the road? I mean, besides the obvious things like, travel and accommodation.
Yeah, travel and accommodation are definitely major costs, especially these days with gas prices and flight costs being so unpredictable.
Yeah, it's crazy out there.
But beyond that, you've got to think about things like paying your crew.
Oh, right, the crew. It's easy to forget about all the people working behind the scenes to make a show happen.
Absolutely. You've got sound engineers, lighting techs, tour managers, stage hands, merchandise sellers. The list goes on and on.
And I imagine they all need to be paid a fair wage.
Of course, these are skilled professionals who are essential to putting on a successful tour.
And then there's the cost of transporting all the equipment.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. Think about all the instruments, amps, speakers, lights, microphones. It's a ton of stuff that needs to be moved from city to city.
And I bet that's not cheap.
Not at all. You're talking about renting trucks or even tour buses, paying for gas, hiring roadies to load and unload everything. It all adds up.
Wow, it's really starting to paint a picture of just how much goes into touring.
And we haven't even touched on the whole issue of streaming royalties yet.
Oh, right, streaming. That's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
It is. You might be surprised to learn just how little musicians actually earn from people listening to their music online.
Yeah, I've heard whispers about that, but I'm not really sure how it all works.
So basically, when you stream a song on a platform like Spotify or Apple Music, the artist gets paid a tiny fraction of a cent per stream.
Wait, a fraction of a cent? That seems so unfair.
It is. Especially when you consider that these platforms are making billions of dollars in revenue.
Right, and I pay for my streaming subscription every month, so you'd think that more of that money would be going to the artists.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the reality is that the way streaming revenue is divided up is incredibly complex, and the artists often end up with the smallest slice of the pie.
That's really disheartening. So basically, even if a musician has millions of streams, they might not be making much money from it at all.
Exactly. And that's a major problem for artists who are trying to make a living from their music.
It's like the whole system is rigged against them.
In a lot of ways it is.
So we've got this situation where touring is incredibly expensive, streaming royalties are abysmally low, and even merch sales, which can be a decent source of income for some artists, often come with hefty cuts taken by venues.
Right. It's a tough landscape out there.
It makes you wonder, why even bother? I mean, if it's so hard to make a living from music, why not just get a real job?
Well, for a lot of musicians, music isn't just a job. It's a calling, a passion, a way of life.
It's in their blood.
Exactly. And they're willing to sacrifice a lot to pursue their dreams, even if it means struggling financially.
And that's why it's so important for us as fans to be aware of these challenges and to support artists in whatever ways we can.
Absolutely. Every little bit helps. And that's what we're going to be exploring in more detail when we come back from the break.
We'll talk about concrete steps that fans can take to support musicians beyond just streaming their music.
Exactly. We'll get into things like buying albums and merch directly from artists, becoming patrons on Patreon, and spreading the word about the music we love.
Sounds good. We'll be right back after this short break. All right, so we've talked about the challenges, the costs, the alternative routes musicians are taking, but it seems like we keep circling back to this one fundamental question.
Yeah, and it's a big one.
How much do we, as a society, truly value art? And more specifically, how much do we value the work that musicians put into creating the music we love?
It's like we say, you get what you pay for. If we're only willing to stream music for free or pay a tiny amount each month for unlimited access, what message does that send?
It almost feels like we've been conditioned to think that music should be free or at least incredibly cheap.
Right, and that devaluation trickles down to the artists themselves.
And I think that's where Kate Nash's point about learning from sex workers becomes really powerful.
That's a bold comparison for sure.
But think about it. They've often been pioneers when it comes to monetizing their work and building direct relationships with their audience online.
They haven't had the luxury of relying on traditional systems, so they've had to be innovative and resourceful.
Exactly. They've built businesses and thriving communities on platforms that many people wouldn't even consider.
And in doing so, They've challenged our assumptions about what's acceptable, what's valuable, and who gets to control the narrative.
It's really inspiring when you think about it.
It is. And I think there's a lot that musicians can learn from that entrepreneurial spirit and that willingness to push boundaries.
And you know what else is interesting? These new models, like Patreon, where fans directly support artists, they actually give more power to the creators.
Right. It shifts the balance away from the big corporations and puts it back in the hands of the artists themselves.
It's almost like a modern day version of patronage, but with a digital twist.
Exactly. You're not just buying a product, you're investing in the artist's journey and becoming part of their creative community.
And I think that's something that a lot of people are craving these days, a sense of connection, a sense of belonging.
We all want to feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big question we're left with is what can we do as listeners to create a more sustainable and equitable music industry?
It's a big question, and there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with small individual actions.
Like what? Give us some concrete steps that we can take.
Well, first and foremost, be a conscious consumer. Ask yourself, how am I currently supporting musicians? Am I streaming for free? Am I buying albums or merch directly from the artists I love?
It's about putting your money where your mouth is, right?
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of sharing Elf. Tell your friends about the artists you love. Go to their shows. Leave positive reviews online.
Spread the love.
Exactly. And if you really connect with an artist's work, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or supporting their crowdfunding campaigns. It can make a world of difference to an independent artist.
So it's about finding what works for you and your budget, but making a conscious effort to support the artists you love in a tangible way.
Right. And remember, it's not just about the money. It's about showing appreciation, respect, and support for the art and the people who create it.
It's about recognizing that music is a gift and that the people who share their talents with us deserve to be compensated fairly.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening, and I hope it's inspired you to think differently about your relationship with music and the artists who create it.
I hope so too. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
Likewise. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember, the future of music is in our hands. Let's make sure it's a bright one. Keep exploring, keep listening, and keep supporting the music you love.